TJ Maxx, Barnes & Noble, BJ. He was finally caught, prosecuted, and sent to jail for 20 years. How did Gonzalez do it? Well, he and a bunch of friends tried war driving. And what they would do is they would drive around in their car looking for insecure wireless networks. They really didn't care who you were. They just cared that your security wasn't terribly good. Right outside of the car park of TJX, a couple of their Marshall stores in Miami, they connected to their wireless network that was using WEP, which is a weak encryption protocol, and they got past the firewall, installed some malware, and that malware stayed on that network for 18 months. 18 months. Collected credit card, debit card data, and you know what? You didn't even have to come in and collect it, Gonzalez. It just emailed it off to him. Well, not emailed, but sent it off to him periodically. Absolutely amazing. What did the court in Canada say? The court in Canada said it's perfectly understandable to have a security breach. But what is actually inexcusable is for it to go on for 18 months. A more recent story, just actually in the last week, another company, Telvent. And this is a company whose software and services are used to remotely administer and monitor large sections of the energy industry. So this is kind of a warring breach. They began warning their customers last week that they were actually investigating an attack. It was done by a Chinese hacking group, cyber espionage. They sold some very important project documents. For a long time, we've been very concerned about the security of power grid systems. The idea that somebody could attack somebody's power system could essentially bring that country to their knees. So this is a real, concern. They were on the network. They don't know how long they were on the network for. Yet again, it didn't look like monitoring was doing too well there. So we're going to have to look at that. Finally, one of the ones that I always find interesting, this last little quote. A gentleman called Rivera, a member of a group called LUXEC. You might have heard of LUXEC, a hacktivist group, often aligned to Anonymous. They were believed to be responsible for the SQL injection attack on Sony Pictures' website in 2011. Downloaded thousands of names, birth dates, addresses, emails, phone numbers, and passwords. And the information was posted to a website called Pastebin. And what did they do? They actually announced the attack on the group's Twitter feed. They tormented Sony on Twitter by saying it is the beginning of the end, and then very nicely said, while they were stealing the data, hey Sony, you know we're making off with a bunch of your internal stuff right now, and you haven't even noticed. So there's a lot of, that's pretty shocking, isn't it? It was, they tweeted that while they were stealing the data, and Sony, they were right, Sony hadn't noticed. There is a lot of drivers to do security monitoring well. One of those drivers is so you don't end up on a slide like this one in a security conference. Another reason you definitely want to do good security monitoring is because we're now seeing increasing amounts of legislation being passed. So data protection laws, like even in this conference, they're talking about Law 1266, the Colombian Data Protection Law. So data protection laws are growing everywhere, and data protection laws say if you collect personal information, if you store personal information, you have to have the right security controls in place in order to protect it. The reason why we always use American stories is not because America is the only place that has security breaches. The reason why we use American stories is because America has data disclosure laws, meaning if you lose data, you have to tell. It's only a matter of time before laws like that will come to this area as well. They're talking about it. Europe already, Germany's introduced it, so it's only a matter of time. So it will be possible to end up on a slide like this. Also, the payment card industry, you may have heard of PCI, Payment Card Industry Consortium of MasterCard, Visa, American Express. They have said any place that processes credit cards, debit cards, you have to put a particular set of security controls in place. And if you don't put those security controls in place and card data gets stolen, they reserve the right to take your right to process credit cards away from you. And it's very hard to stay in business today if you can't process cards. And they have done it before. They did it to Card Systems International, so you don't want to get that wrong. So lots and lots of reasons why we want to monitor. And here is some totally amazing facts. Do you know that more than half of breaches in 2011 remained undiscovered for months? And only 1% of them were detected by log analysis or real-time monitoring. That's a pretty shocking statistic. So who are these people that are breaking into our networks? Well, no surprises, organized criminal groups are behind the lion's share, 83% of all breaches in 2011. Most data thieves are professional criminals deliberately trying to steal information. 3% of attacks were by hacktivists. Interesting, so we're seeing a growth of this. Although they was such a small percentage in 2011, they actually stole over 100 million records, which means they stole twice the amount than those of the financially motivated professionals. So ideological attacks, even though they were less frequent, took a much heavier toll. Out of the 855 incidents examined in 2011, 81% leveraged hacking. 69% included malware. So things we need to protect against. Companies, big and small, saw a huge amount of the malware came in the form of keyloggers, 48%. 99% of all data compromised was actually via moderate to difficult methods, which means we need to monitor access, because once they're in, some of the methods can be quite complex. We need to be aware of preventing malware, because that's the way they're going to get us. How do they mostly get in? Remote access services. 88% of all breaches leverage hacking vectors through this mechanism. Remote services accessible from the internet, default, weak, or stolen credentials. These were the major problems for retail and hospitality organizations. Most of these hackers were not detected by using monitoring. So how did we find about these security breaches? Well, it was actually law enforcement. Law enforcement were generally the way most people found out. And how did they find out themselves? They actually do things like, well, monitor Sony's Twitter feed. I think they found out. Gave Sony a call in that case. They actually do monitor things like social feeds. They do monitor things like pay spins. Also, I don't know if you know, but there are underground auction sites where they sell credit cards, stolen data, project plans. So they monitor those kind of places. The second most common mechanism of being able to detect a breach is through fraud patterns that emerge from common points of purchase. So what was the most common mechanism if it was discovered internally? So if internally the company knew they had a breach, how did they discover it? Invariably, the most common method was in fact log analysis and real-time monitoring. So when you do monitoring well, it really pays off because you find out before law enforcement does, before somebody brings you up. And by the way, that is the way that TJ Maxx found out. It was actually algorithms on the common purchase systems. They rang them up and they said, hey, you know you've had a breach. So that's the way that you normally find out. That's the way you don't want to find out, however. When they come in and they do forensics and they work out, they do have a security breach, what do they use to work that out? They use log information. Every device on your network, the computers, the servers, the firewalls, the routers, they're all logging information. And each one of those devices have a footstep of the attacker. And what we want to do is we want to pull all those footsteps together and be able to build up where the attacker is. That's the idea. Being able to combine these log files and looking for patterns across them, this concept, this idea is correlation. And it's good to actually identify an objective of monitoring. This actually came from the US ICE Act of 2009. So the US government tried to define, well, what do we really want out of monitoring? To monitor, detect, analyze, protect, report, and respond against known vulnerabilities, attacks, and exploitations. And to continuously test and evaluate information security controls and techniques to ensure they are effectively implemented. That's kind of a mouthful. What we're really trying to say is we're trying to be able to detect when somebody's on our network that shouldn't be there, and we want to be able to react and take the right course of actions to prevent this. Okay, so we know what we want to do. So what do I monitor? This is a really good question. What do I monitor? What am I going to get the most value out of monitoring? Well, we have security devices, and strangely enough, we get the best security information from monitoring security devices. And in fact, SIM tools, security incident and event management tools, were actually developed for monitoring IPSs. So the best value you get out of monitoring is IPSs and IDSs. After that, I'd say firewall, okay? But you get really good value out of monitoring these kind of devices. Non-security devices, Windows machines, Unix machines, that kind of thing, they are much more challenging to get good security information out of them. The way that you get good security information out of non-sec devices is you need to understand what your security policy is. These devices don't record information that's intrinsically security oriented. In other words, it says, I logged on, I logged off, I accessed a file, I reset a password. Is that a problem? I don't know. What's your security policy? So with non-security devices, you must put much more thought in there. So you always start with security devices and then you want to move to non-security devices. So examples of things that you want to be able to monitor with non-sec devices. Things like somebody turned off auditing through my group policy on Windows. I want to know about that. I want to know if somebody put somebody into the Windows Schema Administrators group. I want to know about that because that's a group that can wreak havoc on my network. I don't care every time there's a group change, but I do care about those changes. So I need to think much more when I monitor non-security devices to get real value out of them. So how does most people do it? In my experience, this is the way most people do it, and that's why it tends to fail. It is the turn everything on approach. Hey, let's just point all the log files at the device that is going to do magic, and it's going to find security breaches. It's a magic security breach device. I wish I had one of those. It has a little red flag that goes, okay, there's a security breach going on. They don't exist. They don't exist. But what people think, and let's face it, vendors sell them to us. So they, oh, buy this box, point all your logs at it, they'll find a security breach for you anytime it happens. You don't have to do anything. Don't believe that. Just don't believe it. It's not real. If that was true, do you really think only 1% of organizations would detect security breaches through log analysis and real-time monitoring if that was true? So this idea where we've got a log monitoring solution and we're just going to throw all our logs at it, this is not a good idea. All right? Maybe the most common approach. For those who fail to plan, plan to fail. So, what should we be doing? Output-driven monitoring. So the idea of output-driven monitoring